All white people racist?
Well, before I answer that, I would say it depends on what that means to you. If being racist means conscious, intentional dislike and meanness, then no. Are all white people, have we all internalized racist ideology? Yes. Do we move through the world with a racialized experience that benefits us within a system of inequality? Yes.
Chapter 2 of your book is called Why It's Okay to Generalize About White People. One of the things that white people often say is, well, you can't say that about all white people. Robin, you can't say all white people have internalized anything. You can't say that all white people do this or all white people feel like that. And they would say even that the very claim that all white people do anything is itself racist.
And that's why it's chapter 2. It was clear to me after white majority that I had to take that off right away. So first of all, I'm a sociologist, and I'm quite comfortable generalizing about a group of people and describing patterns that are observable and well documented. And that is what I'm talking about, are patterns. There are exceptions to every pattern, but I want us to try to look at the rule rather than the exception. White people in North America live in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race, and white people are the beneficiaries of that separation and inequality. As a result, we are insulated from racial stress at the same time that we come to feel entitled to and deserving of our advantage. Given how seldom we experience racial discomfort in a society we dominate, we haven't had to build our racial stamina. Socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that we either are unaware of or can never admit to ourselves, we become highly fragile in conversations about race. We consider a challenge to our racial worldviews as a challenge to our very identities as good, moral people. Thus, we perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism as an unsettling and unfair moral offense. The smallest amount of racial stress is intolerable. The mere suggestion that being white has meaning often triggers a range of defensive responses. And these include emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress-inducing situation. These responses work to reinstate white equilibrium as they repel the challenge, return our racial comfort, and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy.
So many ways is to be raised to be functionally illiterate on the topic of race. I am white, and part of being white is that I was not raised to see myself in racial terms. I mean, I understood that somebody had race, but not really me. To be white is to see oneself outside of race, to see oneself as a unique, special individual, exempt from the forces of socialization.
So when any of this is triggered, we get off our white racial equilibrium. Right? So what is white racial equilibrium? Well, racial comfort, that's for sure. Seeing ourselves as individuals, seeing ourselves as just human. Obliviousness, well, it's this funny, there's like a stew inside of white people that makes us really irrational on this topic. And I've tried to kind of identify some of those pieces. But one of them is that we really are taught not to see this. So if you're a person of color scratching your head thinking, how can they not see this? Like, I just don't believe they don't see this. We actually really don't see it. Oh, and hell yes, we know it. And we do see it, but we cannot admit that.
So many ways. I would love to never again hear another white person say I didn't own slaves. And this slide will be deliberately dense, and it begins with kidnapping and 300 plus years of enslavement, torture, rape, and brutality, and it carries on. About 1/4 of the way in here, bans on testifying against whites, and you are in my lifetime where it was technically legal to murder black people in this country. And about halfway in at employment discrimination, you are now in 2019 with copious empirical evidence. Employment discrimination, educational discrimination, bias laws in policing, white flight, subprime mortgages, mass incarceration, school-to-prison pipeline, disproportionate special education referrals and punishments, testing, tracking, school funding, biased media, voter suppression, cultural mockery, historical omissions, unaddressed trauma, to name a few. And African Americans are not and have never been in the position to do this to the entire white collective, and the white collective has always been and continues to be in the position to do this to African Americans. There is no such thing as reverse racism. Okay?
Tell me something that white people say to let you know that they're low-key racist.
Happy you asked. I made a list. Why is everything about race? Or why do you make everything about race? I'm okay with it as long as they came here legally. Doesn't matter if you're polka dot, green, purple. I love everyone the same. I'm colorblind. I teach my kids not to see color. I'm not racist. Holds up a picture of themselves with a black friend or relative. I've never had it easy. In response to a conversation about privilege. What about White History Month? Huh? Why don't we get one of those? Why can you guys say it to each other if I can't say it? You don't sound black. You're a very well-spoken person. He should have just complied. Did you go to college on an athletic scholarship? That was over 400 years ago. Get over it. I didn't own slaves personally. I'm not racist. I like Asian women. How is that even racist? Calm down. Everyone's just so sensitive.
Black people do not have a culture of black supremacy. However, white people do. So white people are narcissists, social, cultural, systemic narcissists is who we are because of our racism, because of the lies of white supremacy. How can white people have morality as long as we have bought into the lies of white supremacy? We can't. And I don't use the N-word. What are you doing to fight and dismantle racism that benefits you, white person? Nothing. I ignore it, I deny it, or you perpetrate it. Those are the three things we do. We ignore it, we deny it, or we perpetrate it. That's what most white people do. I hate to say it, but it's true. And that's why I say we're social narcissists, and we have no moral high ground racially. We are sick, hurting people. Hurt people, hurt people. And we've been hurting a long damn time. We're hurting because of the disease of white supremacy. Once again, I'm asking white people to understand, you don't do this just for black people as an anti-racist. You don't do it. I do it because I care about humanity, and I can't stand. I was bullied for many years. I can't stand to see people bullied. That's one reason I do this. It's true. But I'm not here to save anybody except for white folks. Black people can take care of themselves. Yes, white supremacy creates victims, but don't think the only victims are black and brown and indigenous people. We are also victims as the people who are living this grand lie and this grand immorality of social, cultural, and systemic narcissism. White people, you're hurting. Until you heal from racism, you're doomed to live an immoral and toxic life. I've seen it in my own fucking family. Don't tell me it's not true. I've seen it in my own goddamn eyes. Living under the lies of white supremacy makes you sick. Nobody's good enough. You're not good enough. You're living lies. And it's people like Donald Trump, the grandest narcissist of them all. That's why white people love Trump. And don't think it's only the GOP. It's also in liberals. Many white liberals are just as GOPs, just in a different way. So if you're not doing anything to dismantle white supremacy as a white person, again, you are the problem. And you're only hurting yourself by ignoring it. Believe that.
White people, watch this video, and I'll be right back.
He published a book called Race, Tendencies, and Traits of the American Negro, in which he lays out all the numbers, and then he concludes that if we simply avoided allowing black people to have any access to health care, that within 2 or 3 generations, the whole race would die out, and that would solve the race problem in America. When Teddy Roosevelt, 1912, proposed a national health care system, people said no because black people will get it. When Franklin Roosevelt proposed a national health care system, it was the same thing. We don't want black people to get it. When Truman tried it in 1947, same thing. Don't want black people to get it. We have to figure out a way to keep black people from using Medicare. And the way that they came up with was to have a 20% hole, a gap in Medicare, so that you had to pay 20% of your doctor's bill and your hospital bill, and that would discourage poor black people from showing up at the hospitals. Nearly 100% of the reason why the United States is the only country in the world that doesn't define healthcare as a right is because of racism. He published a book called Race, Tendencies, and Traits of the American Negro.
How many times do I have to say this? Racism is a detriment to you white folks, poor white folks especially.
I was today years old when I learned that college used to be free here in the United States. It all changed toward the end of the Civil Rights Movement in the late 60s. Then Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, devised a plan to weed out undesirables. The undesirables were black and brown people on college campuses protesting for civil rights and against the war in Vietnam. Old Ronald started pulling funding from the University of California, so that meant they had to start charging tuition to the students. Slowly, the rest of the country followed suit, and today, the money that would have funded higher education now supports the prison system.
An explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families over the next couple of generations gained, you can do the arithmetic, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity. They used that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation, and of course it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
You ask a good question for somebody that's never heard of the concept of debt. But I bet if your parents died and you inherit their house, you would understand that if they still had a mortgage on that house, you would owe that bank money. The bank wouldn't just say, you know what, the people that borrowed this money are no longer here, so here, you take the deed to the house, it's yours. That's not how it works. You pay the bank now. Otherwise, the bank will take the house, and America is that house. You and I have the great fortune of living in the wealthiest nation in the world. Whether you love America or not, we have a lot of advantages being in America. And that is due in large part to the unpaid labor of enslaved people. And their ancestors, people who are alive today, hold that deed and are still owed that debt. One last thing, we already have paid reparations. America paid reparations after slavery was abolished to the former owners of slaves to compensate them for their lost property. So we have demonstrated an ability to pay reparations. Now it is time, long overdue, to pay reparations to the right people.